they should have mentioned all the issues that Ethereum has, which is very unstable, unpredictable monetary policy, has changed several times. The whole purpose of Bitcoin should be the store of value, should be the best savings technology that was ever invented, and that can store the fruits of our labor for a very long period of time, without any intervention from anybody at their whim. And this is not a process where there are several winners. It's a process that ultimately winner takes all.
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a lot of development since you've been on. I mean, we've seen, for one, this kind of shift in the sentiment in Washington, D.C., I would say, which, we've had multiple pieces of legislation get passed through the House and the Senate. And then we had the approval of the Ethereum ETFs, which kind of shocked a lot of people. But you wrote this piece and you actually think it's pretty bullish for Bitcoin. So let's start there. Like, what's your overall take on this shift in sentiment, and how is it bullish for Bitcoin?
Yeah, first of all, everything is bullish for Bitcoin, right? But in this specific case, I think I'll tell you, like, the number one question that we usually get from investors, right, or used to get from investors, getting a little bit less, but is, our government's going to ban it, right? So you start talking about Bitcoin, the asset, they understand the asset, they understand the returns, they may even understand the fundamentals, but when they get to the end, the inevitable conclusion is, listen, if this is as good as you're saying as a store of value, it definitely means, it could be a risk for the traditional system. And there's absolutely no way governments are going to allow it, right? And I think the recent developments, what we're seeing is that governments are not only allowing it, they're, gradually embracing it. It's a big part of I think the political game theory as well. One of the things I put down on this thread is a quote by Thomas Sowell, right? That says that the first lesson of economics is scarcity, and there's never enough of anything to fully satisfy everyone, right? But then the first lesson in politics is to ignore completely the first lesson of economics. And I think this is exactly where Bitcoin meets politics, right? They had initially completely ignored the value of scarcity in Bitcoin. But there's something that they value more than scarcity, which is votes. And it's very clear that the Bitcoin, electorate is very vocal, very opinionated, very strong. And, there's this funny thing about the number go up that actually makes them very wealthy. So they are going to tilt the scales, and they are tilting the scales. And I think politicians are starting to listen. Let's go back 4 years ago, one cycle ago, and if we mentioned to anybody that the politicians were going to be debating about Bitcoin, and there's going to be one party that is pro Bitcoin, and actually a presidential candidate is going to be talking, people would just say, you're out of your mind. That's never going to happen, right? They don't need to go that far. 6 months ago, if you saw a video of Trump like the one that he just recorded, people would just say that's a deep fake, absolutely no way that, and it did happen, right? So I think there's a very clear shift in sentiment, regardless of, the Biden veto at the end of the day. That doesn't matter too much. The fact is, it's becoming more and more clear that the risk of Bitcoin being banned by government, it's getting lower and lower by the day. I personally think right now it's that risk is pretty much non-existent, or at least very, very small. And I think this is one of the biggest reasons why I think it's very, very bullish to Bitcoin. But there's more to that, right, Sam? Because if you think about it, like the whole process of approval, you mentioned the Ethereum ETF, right? It's another display, I think, of how the political system is broken and needs to be completely redone, right? Take the SEC. If we go back to the Securities Act of 33 and 34, right, when the SEC was created, the main purpose of the SEC was disclosure. So it wasn't to protect investors against new investors, or select what's a good investment or a bad investment for investors. Quite the contrary, it's just disclosure, and that's the way it should be, because what is a good investment for me may not be a good investment for you, may not be a good investment for other investors, right? It should all be taken into the consideration of the risk appetite of the investor, the investment horizon, what other assets they have, right? Where they are located. There's a series, I think, of qualifications and characteristics that you need to take into account. And the fact that the SEC is denying people of getting access to ETFs and to, at the end of the day, just getting access to Bitcoin, right? Just mind-boggling. Their whole purpose should be disclosure. And this is where I think they're still failing, because if we look, the fact that the Ethereum ETF was approved, which, by the way, I think it should have been approved, just like the Bitcoin ETF, right? People should have access to the investment vehicles, but they should also have proper disclosure, right? And the SEC did nothing. It actually, I think it did a disservice to the investment community by trying, or I don't think they tried, but they ended up putting Bitcoin and Ethereum in similar levels, when in fact they're very, very different assets, right? They're both digital, but that's where it stops, right? Ethereum does, if Bitcoin, as we were talking about, has full predictability in monetary policy. If we think about store of value, I don't think there's competition. I think it's even near to having any competition in any other altcoins. And again, the SEC doesn't disclose. It doesn't even mention any of that, right? And I think that's the big failure in this cycle that very few people are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you in terms of, investors should have access to investment vehicles. And it was interesting when you compare when the SEC approved the Bitcoin ETFs versus the Ethereum ETFs, there was like zero comments from any of the commissioners on this approval compared to the Bitcoin ETFs, where Gensler came out with a whole letter basically saying why they did it. And, this isn't saying that you should invest in Bitcoin. They made this whole spectacle out of it, but there was nothing, complete silence with these Ethereum ETFs. I mean, were you surprised by that?
Super odd, right? Yeah, of course I was surprised. And it goes back to my point, right? If you want to do proper disclosure, right, which they should, like the disclosure on Bitcoin, I think, was okay. The people should know it's a volatile asset, right? We talk about this every day, right? That if you're going to buy Bitcoin, you better be ready for the volatility, right? And volatility, it's a feature, not a bug. It just means that we're early, but it's going to be there, and you have to buy it with a time horizon that it's in our view, at least 4, even more years, so you can sustain a full cycle, right? Ideally, it's a 10-year asset, and that's the way investors should be thinking about. And that kind of disclosure, I think it's healthy. It's healthy for Bitcoin also, because if you don't disclose that, right, people are, and we've seen that, right? I've seen that with friends, with family in previous cycles, where they buy and then they see the first draw and they get out, right? And they get out at the worst time possible, because they were just not prepared for the volatility, right? Now, when turning to Ethereum, they should have mentioned, all the issues that Ethereum has, which is, a very unstable, unpredictable monetary policy, has changed several times. I posted on that same tweet thread, a series, and it's even incomplete, but a series of changes in Bitcoin in Ethereum's monetary policy, right? So they're like, I don't know, 6 or 7 of them that happened a long time. And then on the next column is the changes in Bitcoin monetary policy, and it's just an empty column. And it is going to continue to be that way for many reasons tied to game theory. And I think it's not going to happen, at least in monetary policy. It's not going to happen in Bitcoin, because the purpose of Bitcoin is not to be a world computer, and Ethereum is not even that, right? Or the birthplace for a lot of the altcoins. The whole purpose of Bitcoin should be the store of value, should be the best savings technology that was ever invented, and that can store the fruits of our labor for a very long period of time, without any intervention from anybody at their whim, right?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the key point to get through with our education efforts and really Bitcoin. I think that we're going to have to teach people like the differences once again. But they really are just different on every level. And Bitcoin has those properties that allow it to be a good store of value. You brought up the changes to Ethereum's monetary policy, and that's such a key point, because even after the merge, which changed everything about it, They recently just had another upgrade, and it changed the annual issuance rate again, and now it's inflationary. One of the big narratives was that it was like ultrasound hard money because it was deflationary, but they just made another change, and it's actually been inflationary the last couple months. And now they're actually proposing another thing about changing the issuance rate again. And so it just goes to show it doesn't really matter like what those changes are. It's the fact that it is changing. That is the key point. And that's the big difference between Bitcoin, right?
But Sam, in situations like this, I always try to think about, put myself in the shoes of the investors, right? And I understand why people are attracted to Ethereum at first glance, right? Because they walk into a world like this is a complete new world for them. So if you're talking about, a traditional investor, and now again with institutions, we are going to go through this. It's going to be frustrating, and I think it's our job to try to point these risks out to people. Is that they invest in Bitcoin, and the same way they are used to the traditional system where they're going to buy a stock and they're like, okay, so now I bought Apple. So what's the next step? Oh, I should buy Google. I should buy Amazon. I should diversify my portfolio. And with that, try to put my money to work in different places so I can kind of like capture, I increase my chances of capturing some of the winners. And that works when you're talking about companies, that works when you're talking about indices, that works, that even works a little bit less, but it works when you're talking about bonds, it works when you're talking about real estate, it works when you're talking about a lot of traditional assets. It doesn't work when you're talking about the base layer, monetary asset that we would have, right? If you think about one of the challenges we have with fiat money is the fact that, if you think about dollars, right? Dollars should be a reference point. It should be a reference price for everything else, right? By the way, just to go back 1 second, and I ask this a lot, like a lot of our investors, particularly the institutions in the US, they'll come to you, they say, yeah, but I should diversify, I should buy other companies. And then very quickly, you should just turn to their portfolio, and their portfolio top to bottom, with a very, very few exceptions, 100% dollar base, right? So they have not diversified their dollar exposure. And when you ask them that question, right, they say, oh no, but the dollar is the monetary base layer of the world, right? And this is exactly the bet of Bitcoin, is that it's going to replace, initially not 100%, but partially it's going to replace the dollar. So there's no point to diversifying that. And that was very well put by an economist many years ago, Grisham's. And there's the Grisham's law that says that investment, this is not a process where there are several winners. It's a process that ultimately winner takes most of it, winner takes all, right? Because if you are an economic agent, let's say the fiat debasement continues, and you have two options to put your money. I'll tell you this, like if you live in Brazil and you have two options, I gave the option to the whole population in Brazil. I said, listen, today you have to choose. You're either going to put 100% of your assets in Brazilian reais, or you're going to put 100% of your assets in Bitcoin, right? Vast majority of, if they put a gun on their head, say you got to decide this today, vast majority would decide to go to Bitcoin. Because they know, again, they're very well scholared in the ways that government can debase them and can continue to debase their currency in the long term, right? And if people really need to make the decision, ultimately, of course, I'm exaggerating because there's still a lot of education to do, but to those that know at least a little bit, they'll move 100% to Bitcoin. There's no question asked. Mm-hmm. So when they go to the same conclusions on altcoins, say, yeah, I bought Bitcoin, now I need to buy Ethereum, I need to buy, whatever it is, Litecoin, whatever is the next altcoin, or even meme coins, or whatever it is, right? We just just tell them the same thing. It's like, listen, this is not diversification, it's worsification, because you're going to end up with one asset that it's going to perform and the others are not going to perform. And you don't need to do much. Just go back, right? Go back in time, and that's exactly what has happened, right? Bitcoin has captured this, has been a majority or larger market cap and with high dominance in this market for a long period of time. And in the meantime, thousands and thousands of coins that, all of them came with new features, with different things that were supposed to be better than Bitcoin. They all gradually disappeared and ended up, not only underperforming, but in many of these cases, losing everything, right?
Mhm.
We point to Ethereum and we point to the coins that are still around, but the reality is that for every Ethereum that it's out there, there are 1,000, 10,000s of them that completely vanished and disappeared, overnight, where there's not even price anymore. If you bought some of these coins, you're gone. You lost all your assets. We did some analysis on this. You helped me on that as well. It's a little outdated because it's a year or so late ago, but it only got worse, right? But we look at remember correctly, like 8,000 altcoins. Vast majority, if you look at how much you lost, if you invested in the whole basket of altcoins compared to Bitcoin, you lost like 90+% or high 90s%, right? A lot of them ended up disappearing. There are only like 40 of them that outperformed Bitcoin, and on average, they only outperformed by 40%, which again, it's not worth the risk, right? You're not going to be able. None of us are going to be able to pick the 40 altcoins that outperform Bitcoin. And by the way, I just glanced at those 40, and the 40s are not 40 anymore. They're like less than 20 already. So they're just going to history. Really well.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, Bitcoin's been really doing well against the altcoins over the last year or so. And even so, like you brought up, like how they performed, but from cycle to cycle, usually you got a couple ones that outperform, but very, very few outperform from like multiple cycles, right? A lot
100%.
of times like a darling or two for that cycle, and then they never reach their prior all-time highs against Bitcoin. So
100%. You look at the first cycle, like at 2014, 2015, right, which were all coins with better features than Bitcoin. They all disappeared with very few exceptions. And then you look at the ICO cycle, all of those coins. There's so many coins that people said, oh, Neo, whatever it was, right? Like thousands of them. Oh, this is going to be the new Bitcoin. It's much better than Bitcoin. And I had people arguing with me, the time and time again, say, no, you don't know what you're talking about, right? Bitcoin is slow. Bitcoin is not going to scale. Bitcoin has this issue or that issue. But they're all forgetting a few things. The first one is what I mentioned, that at the end of the day, right, this is a winner takes all. And I'll tell you more. Think about fundamentals, right? So give one step back and think about another thing people miss. By definition, any of these altcoins that are coming out there, they're coming with all these new great features, right? By definition, they need to be open source. So this is very different than companies coming in with a new product, coming into a new market and capturing the market and having a competitive advantage. By definition, if let's say tomorrow a new coin comes in with something that is significantly better than Bitcoin, if it is going to compete for store of value, it does necessarily need to have the code 100% open source, 100% open for verification. And then people are just going to look, we as Bitcoiners, let's say it is really something really good, something we haven't thought about that could scale Bitcoin, I don't know, 1,000x overnight with no risk, right, or very little risk, because that's the other thing people don't take into consideration of the risk. But let's just take a hypothetical example that happened. Code is open source, right? If it is that good, if it is that obvious that it's a good feature, it very, very quickly somebody's going to submit a PR to the Bitcoin core code, and it's going to be upgraded. And I'm going to be upgrading my node. You're going to be upgrading your node, and then Bitcoin is going to have that feature as well, right? There's no competitive advantage for these coins. Just the opposite. Bitcoin already has the network effects, which it's a challenge for any of these other coins to compete with. It's 15 years of adoption, right? Good luck competing with that.